I think I should start, Rajesh.
1 second, 1 second, 1 second.
Still quite a lot of people coming in from the waiting room.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Swati, can you try recording this? I don't know. I'm not getting the recording button. Can you try, Swati?
Okay. When I couldn't see that button.
You're using a new Zoom
new
account. I
version.
don't know what's happening.
Yes.
But I think it's okay. We can start. Anyway, we are on live stream. No problem. We'll have a copy of the record. No problem.
Okay.
Yeah, please start.
1 second. Greetings to everyone. This is Swati from India, and on behalf of the core committee of chrisis.org, I extend my heartiest welcome to one and all who are joining us here on Zoom and also connecting us from Facebook Live from across the world. Today is the 5th episode of the In Conversation series. In this, we portray prominent innovation scholars of the day in the form of intellectual and bibliographical interviews. The idea is to understand the evolution of intellectual being himself. That is very important not only to grasp the core ideas of their research, but also give a roadmap, a sort of optimism to the coming generation of researchers. Today is a very special event. We are having with us Professor John Bessant, Emeritus Professor of Innovation and Entrepreneurship at University of Exeter, UK. Originally a chemical engineer, it would be fascinating to know his journey as he did his PhD in innovation studies and his research that concerns mainly with the process of technological innovation and its management, along with humanitarian innovation and ecosystems for innovation. Professor Bessant will be in conversation with another very prominent scholar of innovation studies, Professor Howard Rush, who has been actively involved in the field of innovation studies since 1974. He is a founder member and head of Center for Change, Entrepreneurship and Innovation Management, formerly known as Centrim. Professor Rush has worked extensively in the areas related to the impact of information technology, diffusion of new technologies in developing countries, evaluating innovation policies, and also about illegal innovation, focusing upon cyber crimes. So I welcome you both. So today's program is will be of about 2 hours. We will begin with a one-to-one conversation between Professor John Bessant and Professor Howard Rush for 1 hour, and then we will be having a break for 5 minutes. And in the next 1 hour, we will be joined by a panel of eminent scholars, Professor Joe Ted from SPRU, and Professor George Sikoras, head Centrim University of Britain. He is with us. Thanks for joining, both of you. And they will be asking questions to Professor John, followed by an open house Q&A from the audience. With this, I invite and hand over this virtual stage to Professor Howard Rush. And Professor Howard, please.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation to participate in this series. And I have to say, one of the reasons I'm particularly delighted to be doing this is because you cannot imagine how difficult it is to get a one-on-one conversation with John Bessant. And even if I have to do this in public, that's fine, because the guy is so busy that I never get to see him for this long in any one go. So it's especially pleasing for me. Now, before I, as I was preparing to do this interview, I went and looked at your CV, John. And it is something that I would advise any young researcher that's viewing this, don't do it. Don't do it. This is a health warning. It's absolutely soul destroying. I mean, if you look at it, you'll decide that either there's nothing left to do in this field because he's done it all, or that there's no way that you're going to be able to match the sort of productivity and achievements that John has reached. Not only has John published over 150 academic papers, he has 40 books to his name, one of which, Managing Innovation with Joe Tidd and Keith Pavitt, was first published in 1997 and is now in its 7th edition. We'll hear from Joe later, and maybe he can reflect on that collaboration, perhaps. He's got, in addition, 60 book chapters and an innumerable number of articles in trade journals. It says on Jean's CV that he speaks half a dozen languages. I have to confess, I've only heard him speaking 3, so I'm not sure about the others. But after spells in industry, it was mentioned that John started his career as a chemical engineer. John worked in academia at the University of Aston in Birmingham, the University of Brighton, Imperial College, Cranfield University, and the University of Sussex when he was at SPRU. He's been a visiting professor in Norway, Germany, Luxembourg, Austria, a fellow of the British Academy of Management, fellow of the UK Sunningdale Institute, at the UK School of Government. They're the people who train civil servants, the Irish Management Institute. In fact, I always had to have 2 Rolodexes because I had to have a separate one just for John Bessant because he worked at so many different places. For the younger people in the audience, you're going to have to, I know you're going to have to Google what a Rolodex actually is. It's not even worth mentioning the list of countries that he's either taught in or been involved in high-level policy advice. In fact, if you think of any country in the United Nations, he'll have left his footprint there. And, you know, he's worked with companies from Lego to Toyota. Just think of any company in the Fortune 500, he'll have been there. And then square that number in order to include all of the SMEs that he has supported in one way or another. And something that's not included in his CV, but should be evident from the backdrop of the room that John is actually sitting in at the moment, which I presume is your studio, John. John is actually an accomplished musician and plays at least a dozen different instruments. He's also, and some of you out there know and will have heard John because he was the leader of a covers band called The Business, which received some fame in academic circles, but more of that later. The breadth of John's research interests are really incredibly wide-ranging. And if I was going to summarize his interests and achievements in a single sentence, it would be to understand and spread understanding of how ideas are turned into something that adds value. And I think that all of the projects that he's been involved with over his life, that sums it up in terms of your aims and objectives to do it. But as I said, do not look at his CV, but what I would encourage you to look at is his website. Because John has produced, in my opinion, the best website that I've ever seen. That's bar none, John. I'm really serious about that too. You can find all of his blogs, all of his VOGs, It is an incredibly well-designed and informative website. And I went on to it the other day. In fact, it was just yesterday that I went back to revisit it. And it asked me if I wanted to sign up for his newsletter and the notifications, which foolishly I did. I clicked the box this time to do it. And just an hour before this interview started, I got two notifications. One about I don't know if it's a blog or a vlog, about P.G. Wodehouse and innovation. And the other one is something called spaghetti and innovation. So please, all of you should have a look at it. It's a thing of wonder. Now, I first met John almost exactly 40 years ago to this month. I happened to be working at the time at NEDO, the UK National Economics Development Organization. And John was working at the TPU, the Technology Policy Unit at the University of Aston in Birmingham. I guess it was your first academic job. Now, I had cut my teeth on science policy at SPRU. And this was at the time when microelectronics was first coming into to be of interest. It was actually, they were known as the job killers at the time. And so this goes well before artificial intelligence and concern about the replacement of jobs. This was a serious debate point even 40 years ago about microelectronics. And I was hired by NEDO to work with a tripartite committee of industrialists, trade union officials, and civil servants to look into the impact of microelectronics on employment. And I decided that I needed to familiarize myself with work going on around the country at the time. And so I arranged a visit to the TPU where I met up with John. I hadn't known him before, and also with the head of the TPU, Professor Ernest Brown at the time. Now, John, you were doing a study at that time. I think it was about innovation in iron foundries. Now, not exactly the sexiest of sectors, either then or now, but little did I know that that after that first meeting that we were going to have 40 years of collaboration and a joy to me to say friendship since that time. But I'd like to start really by asking you is, how did you get into the field? How did a chemical engineer working in industry move into academia?
Well, first of all, thanks very much. It's great to see you and indeed everyone else. I've got a serious case of imposter syndrome creeping up on me now. I think, wow, I can only defend myself by saying I've done a lot of things because my philosophy is if you move fast enough, nobody ever pins you down long enough to see that you don't know what you're talking about or doing. But no, thank you for that. Yeah, a good question. How did I get into this? Like a great deal of what I've done, almost by accident, by lucky coincidences. As you probably heard with the introduction, once upon a time, I was an engineer. I really wouldn't trust me in an oil refinery today because I'd blow it up. But once upon a time, I did know what that was about. And that's how I started my job. So I was working as a chemical engineer, feeling a bit interested and a bit frustrated by this innovation question because it wasn't as easy as it ought to be. The companies I worked for were mostly big, so they had plenty of money. They employed lots of smart people, me included, so that wasn't the problem. So all these ingredients that ought to make innovation work weren't working as well as they could. So I had this kind of nagging frustration. But I guess something else about my whole career, and perhaps I could start with that, I owe it to a great many people. I've really benefited enormously from people who have been mentors, been lighthouses, if I can call them that, who've helped me sort of guide. And one of the first was my old supervisor from the university, my engineering supervisor, who was a man, Sidney Gregory, who actually was one of the founders of the whole design thinking movement. He wrote a book called The Design Method way back in 1965. He had ideas way beyond the narrow world of thermodynamics and chemical reactions. And he infused me with some of this. And he kind of he'd kept in touch while I was working in industry. And he came up with a proposition for me, an offer I couldn't refuse, which was, how would you like to do a PhD? Well, I wasn't all that keen at the time, I must be honest. I thought of PhDs doing somebody else's experiments, being a sort of apprentice for 3 years, and then getting a reward at the end, which was this title. But he said, no, I want to offer you something different. I got a real company that want to learn about innovation. And the idea is you go and work for them as an engineer, but also watch and work out how they manage innovation and could they do it better, and be a bridge between the academic world, the knowledge base, and this. So it was a fascinating challenge. I had no idea what I was letting myself in for, but that's how I started. And I had 3 wonderful years working in a company up in Scotland. We were making pigments, the colors that go into paints and the inks and things. So we're making things, but we were also trying to innovate in products, obviously coming up with a lot of different colors for different marketplaces. And also the bit I was involved in, process change. As you mentioned, this was the very early days of applied electronics. So we could finally start controlling things reliably. And I was particularly part of a team trying to drag that industry from the 19th century, a kind of alchemy world, into the 20th, put things under control. And that perhaps was one of my first object lessons about innovation. You got to think about people. We'd worked as engineers on a really exciting project. Technically, we were using very new sensors. In fact, we'd visited a hospital and looked at the kidney machine and how we could use the dialysis membrane as part of our rig. So we had something which would control this very old process reliably. And the day came when we took this to the factory floor, really proud of what we'd achieved. And I learned 2 very important lessons. The first was that what works in the lab doesn't work in the real world. There's an awful lot of movement there. That was a good technical lesson. But the real lesson was that basically, as we walked onto the shop floor with our new technology, the workforce walked off. Of course, you've mentioned it yourself. I mean, this was an early example of the potential job-killing status of this technology. At the minimum, it was going to change the skills pattern. It certainly shifted the power base because they knew what they were doing before and they could control things. So long story short, it taught me a lot of lessons very fast about what not to do in innovation and also what to do in terms of inclusion. But I had 3 wonderful years doing this at night, swatting up on what was written, and there wasn't that much written around the world of practice and innovation, although there was quite a bit of theory. But I was trying to take this, look at how it made sense in this world I was living in, engage many other people in it. So this was a sort of shared learning journey for the whole company. And we tried to change things, and 1 or 2 of them actually worked. But I do remember one of the really important points there, and one of the really important people was, of course, Chris Freeman. Because Chris, and I know everybody knows what a great academic he was, what a wonderful thinker, but he also took the trouble to write for the world of practice. And there's a lovely article published in Electronics and Power. Now, there's a journal that I'm sure none of you have ever heard of, but Chris wrote a nice magazine article which basically summed up success and failure factors in innovation and the kinds of things you should think about, which for somebody like me trying to help a company learn these lessons was enormously valuable. And so that was my introduction to Chris Freeman and the work of Sprue. And I thought, wow, this is important. And I still have, unfortunately, I'm not at my office, I'm in my studio, but on my desk downstairs is a penguin, not a real live bird, I mean the book Penguin, but it's Chris's, or the original version of Chris's Economics of Industrial Innovation. But without question, even before I'd met him, that kind of thinking was important. So long story short, 3 wonderful years, and I got a taste for the academic perspective. I thought I'd like to learn more of this. I'd like to perhaps do some research on it. And I was very fortunate because the microelectronics wave was just beginning to break. And dare I say it, there was an awful lot of assumptions being made that just didn't get borne out in terms of the engineering. I realized what I understood from an engineering perspective about how this stuff worked was an important piece of the puzzle. And I began to understand that this innovation thing is interdisciplinary, that actually it does need lots of different people in the puzzle. I can see my dear friend Rafi Kaplinsky up in the corner of my screen. Hi, Rafi, great to see you. I met Rafi back at a meeting in Lund University. It was my first international trip as a researcher. And we were talking about microelectronics. And there were a lot of economists in the room and a lot of political scientists and others. I don't think anybody from the engineering side apart from me. And I realized actually I was out of my depth, but learning fast. But I suspect some of the things I had to say about what the technology could and couldn't do was relevant for that discussion as well. So that kind of meeting point between different perspectives was quite important. But I was fortunate to do my early work at, as you mentioned, Howie, the Technology Policy Unit, which was a very much modeled on Sprue. It was set up by another of my lighthouse figures, Ernest Brown. But Ernest was a physicist who'd worked in Silicon Valley in the very earliest days. His name's on many of the patents that led to the electronics revolution. But Ernest had a social conscience and really felt that that mission of putting science and technology at the service of society and being careful how we used it led him to set up a group emulating what was going on at Sprue, a master's program in science and society, and a number of research projects around it. And that's how I got into this academic game, where I've been on and off ever since. But I suppose, just to finish that up, probably the perspective I bring is very much still one of engineering, of making something happen. So I'm not a very theoretical person, hands up to that. I'm much more interested in how we take that knowledge base, what we've learned about innovation, but actually make it happen, management of innovation. So I guess that's where I'm coming from, and trying to perhaps act as a bit of a boundary spanner between different people, different disciplines, different groups, trying to channel that kind of knowledge across. But that's the thumbnail sketch anyway, Harry.
Thanks, John. I should have mentioned, I mean, John and I have spoken many times over the years about mentoring. And, John actually has supervised over 50 PhDs. At least that's what it says on his CV. It didn't actually say how many passed, but you supervised 50 or more. And I'm sure you've mentored many other people. Certainly, we share Chris Freeman as being an important mentor. I mean, I originally came to the UK for my postgraduate work because of wanting to study with Marie Jahoda, the amazing social psychologist. I mean, one of the greatest of the 20th century in terms of her creativity in methodology. And as an aside to this, I'd like to for those people who don't know who Marie Jahoda was, you should visit the Sprue website because, well, she passed away 20 years ago this year. But every year, and even before she died, Sprue has held a commemorative lecture to Marie Jahoda that actually the director of Sprue, Jeremy Hall, when he was a postgraduate at Sprue, set up. And it's still going on. And this year, to commemorate the 20th year since she died, was a special edition of that lecture, and it is online, and it's really worth having a view because it shows just how remarkable her creativity to methodology in social science has been. It was extraordinary. And Marie was one of the founders, together with Chris, of Sprue. And of course, Chris, who you've already mentioned and who this series is dedicated to, was a mentor to both of us. And I think that, a lot of people, when they talk about Chris Freeman, think about the contributions he's made to economics, and SPRU during the early days was a real maverick institution in terms of bringing in innovation studies into the mainstream. For me, what was even more important in terms of Chris, that and his humanity, of course, was his rigor. Because I know as a young research assistant and then research fellow at SPRU, he made sure that I knew where the standards were set and that we were not allowed to fall below them. And as long as we met those standards, he would defend us, to the hilt, in terms of anything that might be seen as anti-establishment in the day. He would not, counter any of that as long as we met those standards. And I think that was for me perhaps the most important lesson from Chris as my mentor in those days. But going back to your career trajectory, you joined Brighton, which was then a polytechnic. I think it was in 1982. And that as a year before you actually persuaded me to join you in building a research capacity as an underpinning to the business school of the Polytechnic, in order for them to get accredited to do master's degrees. That's why we both were hired at the time, because they wanted to develop a postgraduate program and know that they needed an underpinning of research. And we conducted evaluations of government policy, policies that were to facilitate firms in the uptake of microelectronics and flexible manufacturing systems. We conducted a forecasting project for NEDO on the long-term social and economic impact of IT. And only a few years ago, we revisited that study because it was 25 years old, to see what we got right and what we got wrong, and published an article on it. And eventually we generated sufficient resources from the UK Research Council projects to hire a handful of researchers. And we formed the then fledgling research group called the Innovation Research Group, a name which didn't last very long because we realized that IRG or ERG didn't sound very good as an acronym. We've worked on a lot of projects together over the years, including the role of intermediaries in innovation systems. And more recently, we both made the decision, after having a long discussion, really to dedicate the last 10 years of our career to working on the humanitarian innovation ecosystem, where we did a lot of work for the UN. And I'm going to be asking you about what your greatest hits are in terms of the research projects. But I suspect, well, at least for me, one of the greatest hits and your part of your lasting legacy was the founding of Centrum at Brighton. Now, in those days, Centrum was the Center for Research and Innovation Management. It's evolved, and perhaps reflecting change in the field as well. It's now is the Center for Change, Entrepreneurship, and Innovation Management. And I think it's interesting to see how our field has changed over the years and broadened out to include what might be, sibling fields at the time. But I think I was thinking that if we had hashtags in those days, when we founded the research group, the hashtag would have been closing the loop, or action research, because this was the fundamental philosophical foundations to what we wanted to achieve, the vision and the mission of Centrum. And largely it was based upon your interest, both in action learning and double loop learning. So, can I ask you to reflect on the creation of Centrum and how it evolved during your time there?
Yeah, I mean, well, You've done a very good job of sort of setting the antecedents. I was very lucky. I came to the end of a contract up at Birmingham. I was wondering what to do next, looking at various options. And then I had another of these offers I couldn't refuse. And rather similar to the PhD, it was a very blank sheet of paper. My old boss at the time was basically looking to develop research for the reasons Howie suggested, and didn't really mind what. So I had this wonderful opportunity to open up research, relevant research, in what became a business school, what was a department of management at the time. So this was it was a canvas on which I could, and very quickly Howie and I could paint, but without many constraints, apart from trying to raise the money to keep the thing going and to grow it. So it was a great opportunity. And I guess the lessons I'd already been learning in my time at in Birmingham, even back to my PhD, this idea of communicating, translating things into the world of practice, making sense of them for people in a different context. I did, as one of the many things I did to keep myself going in the early years in Birmingham, I worked for a university spin-off company, which was trying to ride the microelectronics wave. And they were really good techies. They really understood how to write software and build hardware. They weren't actually very clear on how to connect with the actual users. And my role in that was a kind of technical sales missionary. I was going out to all sorts of companies. I had a whale of a time seeing how many, many different things are made. But my role was essentially to see opportunities to use electronics to improve things, and then to communicate that back to the technical people at the university. Great fun, but I realized then this idea of connection is important between different audiences. How we mentioned, I do speak a couple of languages, but maybe this is a kind of language thing, being able to speak and understand different cultures and connect them. Certainly, that was for me a really important role that needed playing. It underpins particularly the work that Howie and I did around intermediaries very much. But working at Centrium, I realized, or working at what became Centrium, I realized we could build on this. We could build across in the university. So a lot of our early research grants were with engineers and other colleagues in other departments, and always this essence of working with that world of practice. I mentioned it before. It was, for me, the fundamental space in which I wanted to work, the management of innovation. And we were trying to think about how we could put our brochure together as Centrium grew, and how he's outlined, we managed to attract money and grow some projects and get some great people on our team. And we realized it was really about what we started to call closing the loop. And that has a very specific resonance. Some of you may know the work of David Kolb, the social psychologist, but Kolb's idea of how adults learn, experiential learning, was powerful. Amongst other things, it helped shape my whole attitude to teaching. But essentially, his argument is that we don't just learn through an injection of knowledge. We learn by having some experience, which we then reflect on, trying to work out what was happening. We distill concepts which seem to make some sense. They add to our theory of the world. And then we try that out on the world, which, of course, generates more experience. So there's a learning cycle, a learning loop. And what we realized was, for the world of practice, and I'd include in that the world of policymaking practice, so not just the private sector, but the world of practice, life is full of trying things out desperately and drowning in experience. It's a constant series of firefighting crises. What's often missing is the opportunity to reflect in a structured way, and also some concepts which might help ease things out in the practical world. Conversely, the world of the academic is sometimes heavily biased towards reflection and theorizing. And we sit in our armchairs, and that's a very pleasant activity. Closing the loop depends where you start, but closing the loop was our attempt to bring these two worlds together. And for me, and I'm sure for you too, Howie, it's become a kind of more than a mantra. It really is a way of working. I couldn't imagine doing it any other way. For me, I'm delighted to see these days the buzzword in innovation is agile innovation. And basically the principle is you don't just work for days and days and days to create your product all on your own and then launch it hopefully on the marketplace. you interact, and you interact from the earliest part of your concept, your minimum viable product. But it's the interaction which creates something. And I think for me, closing the loop was all about that. And it led us to some wonderful projects and some wonderful people, many of whom came from the world of practice into our world. And thinking of a couple of people in particular, it also changed the tools we used. We weren't then simply working as, I've got to be careful here, conventional researchers using the sort of very academic toolkit, but we were also into this world of what's loosely called organizational development or action research. Our dear friend and colleague, David Francis, joined us, did his PhD with us. But Dave had years, decades of great experience in the world of practice as a very successful consultant about helping organizations change. And much of his perspective and his methods became the way we do things in the Centrum culture, adding that to our repertoire. But I think perhaps one other name I should mention in all our lighthouses, because otherwise we can lose that. When I was still finishing my PhD, but beginning to talk about it, I was slightly worried, and I was called to the House of Lords at one stage, which is pretty scary if you're a young engineer with a PhD that isn't yet published. But it was a room in the House of Lords where the committee who had funded my research were meeting. And it was really me delivering the results of what they'd invested 3 years of public money in. They were representatives of what at the time was called the Joint Committee. And it was joint between the Social Science Research Council, which included the economists, sociologists, and so on, and the Science Research Council, which included the engineers. The names have changed, but those two institutions still exist. But they both recognized that there was somewhere in the middle where things like innovation happened, which was this interdisciplinary mix. And I was very fortunate because on that panel who were reviewing me, and I have to say were immensely kind, was somebody called Roy Rothwell. And many of you may know from Spru's history, Roy represents perhaps the wing that I would be most closely aligned with in Spru, the management of innovation. Roy wrote a great deal in this space and was for me another of these very powerful lighthouses, but partly because we shared this same view about the need to close the loop back into the practical world. So yeah, that's the closing the loop, Howie.
I mean, it's interesting that, nowadays a lot of people talk to another buzzword, which is the co-production of knowledge. And we were doing this well before it ever became into the vernacular. You mentioned policy research as well. I wouldn't want people just to think that Centrum and your work was related to management and application within management, whether it's in the private or the public sector. Because one thing that happens while we were both, at Centrum is that we had a visit from this young woman from Venezuela. And she wanted to know about what we did. And it turns out that this woman was the director of technology in Venezuela for the Ministry de Fomento. And her name was Carlota Perez. I don't know what's happened to her since then, but she was so interested in the work that we were doing that she brought over 13 young, high-flying Venezuelans from a range of different fields, but I think most were civil servants, to come and study with us for a month. It may have been 4 to 6 weeks or so. And to help form them as a team, which could then introduce innovation policy and science policy into Venezuela. Now, that was in 1987, I think, that it first they first came. They started a program which they named then PI. We actually had ties made. I mean, it was really quite a group bonding exercise for them as well. And they came for a month, and PI was the Programa de, I apologize for the mispronunciation, Carlota, but the Programa de Actualización Industrial. I'm delighted to say that these people became close friends of ours over the years. Some became government ministers. One became the head of the airport authority. Others became leading lights in different think tanks and in academia, both in South America and North America as well. It was always interesting that in their putting the program together, which had to report to a junior minister within that ministry, that even though the government stayed the same there at the time, every time a junior minister changed hands and they brought in a new junior minister, Carlotta would have to fly us both over again in order to resell the program to this new junior minister, because of course they wanted a program that was attached to them, sort of thing. But it was a wonderful activity, and it was probably the most fun project that I've ever been involved in. And it also began to move Centrum from being just a national research group into something which began to have international reach. And eventually something which I'm delighted to say that through independent validation, we were rated not just one of the 5 best research groups in our field in the UK, but one of the 10 best internationally. What are your recollections about those days and the PI project and the other work that you've started to do internationally? Because I mentioned, you've been in every country in the UN. So any thoughts you want to contribute on that?
I love your use of the word recollections. You have to remember lots of wonderful nights in the Caribbean with people who are by definition 24-hour driven. They never seem to sleep, but there were a lot of parties, and I have to say quite a lot of Cuba Libre were drunk in my case, but I do have some recollections though. But I think more seriously, for me, it was really powerful to see at scale this idea that industry policy, innovation policy could be more than just giving out grants or tweaking tax regimes. It could actually intervene. And what we were really trying to do was create people who could enable to act as a cadre of policy actors and intermediaries. And very much the concern was to try and translate innovation ideas into practice, particularly building still on the rising technological tide around electronics, but essentially trying to make change happen. We spent a lot of time in firms understanding what they were trying to do. And that was really powerful in terms of, again, this kind of translation, this communication of good theoretical ideas, but how do we make things happen in practice? And also for me, it really began to show up how the perceptions from the end users of policy, the companies and other players in the system, and the policymakers, how the understanding needed to develop on both sides. And I think that was very much something that took me to many other places. One of the characteristics of being a close neighbor of SPRU and of Sussex University, we were also very close to IDS, the Institute for Development Studies. And through Rafi and many of his colleagues, I was involved, or we were in Centrum, various of us, involved in a lot of development programs, which were interesting because they'd often begin at the highest level, ministerial, prime ministerial level, looking for the industry strategy, how the country might develop. But eventually it comes down to what happens on the ground. And a phrase that Robin Murray used to use a lot was the idea of transmission belts. What's going to connect all this wonderful stuff with the wheels on the ground? And I was very excited in that space because it was, again, translation. It was taking ideas, putting them into practice. A close runner for the greatest fun was probably the work I did in various places with Rafi in factories trying to change them. The model was very simply, if we could work with a trade association, get a lot of companies at least interested and perhaps have a lecture or something, and then find one or two who'd be prepared to risk their factory and change it with all the others looking on, we might actually make something happen. And we had great fun, whether it was in fruit factories or cardboard box makers or whatever, all sorts of different places, but the same principle. And it was trying to take ideas and put them into practice in ways that people could actually access. So this, again, was not giving lectures and giving the concept, it was finding ways of closing the loop. Great fun, but also I think quite a powerful move forward in terms of how to take this, this kind of thinking, how to make change actually happen. We also, I think, learned to deploy lots of different methods. I think for me, one of the exciting things was the use of games. Games, we assume, are for fun, but games actually as a learning device are immensely powerful. Not least they break language barriers. You don't even need to speak the same language if you can play the game and have a shared experience. And one of the things I probably did was make the fortunes of the Lego company, I say me and my colleagues, because we had a game we developed which involved lots of Lego bricks which were used in a simulated factory. And it was a bad factory, and then it became a good factory. It's a great game. We took this all around the world, but essentially it did break the barriers. It did get the message across in ways that no number of high prestige, high profile lectures would have done. Perhaps the limit of that was when Rafi and I were in Kazakhstan, and it was winter, I remember that, so it was ever so cold, but we were trying to help a group of managers come to terms with the shock that had hit them. The collapse of the Soviet Union, Kazakhstani factory managers suddenly having to innovate, but not having a clue of where or how, or even how the more competitive market environment functioned. And after a morning spent trying to do through a translator, the kind of lecture-based management training, we tore it all up. And we spent the rest of the week at night in the bar over a few beers inventing games. And this was immensely creative and fun, but we were inventing games that would provide the experiences the next day from which managers could learn. I think they did. We had some very good feedback. I certainly learned. I thought this is a powerful addition to our repertoire of tools. And of course, again, much of that went back to the program, particularly the PI program, which ran for so long. It gave us a chance as a laboratory to work with some very smart people to co-create a different approach. Yeah, so lots of fun. And those are only the recollections I've got. There's probably a lot more I've forgotten.
Now, we've concentrated so far, I think rightfully, because we were both involved in it, on your Centrum career. But as I also mentioned in the introduction, that there have been a large number of other universities and academies that you've worked for. You had itchy feet. And I think one of the interesting comparisons between, although we collaborated very, very often, one of the differences in terms of our career paths is I stayed at Centrum for 36 years, and you worked with a large number of different places. Now, could you not hold down a job, or was it that nobody else wanted to employ me? But I think it might be interesting, particularly for some of the younger researchers, to hear your reflections on perhaps the value in what you got out of going to different places, throughout your career.
Yeah, well, it would be nice to think that I had a master strategy and I was going to do this, then that, and then that. As you're beginning to gather, I think it's been very much lucky opportunities, lucky breaks. But I think looking at them, they taught me different things. And that was really the valuable point, that moving provides you with different contexts, even if you're doing the same thing, just being in that different context. If I'm specific about a few of those, Cranfield University, if you don't know it, it's only postgraduate in the UK, and it's got a very strong reputation for being tightly linked with practice. So you can see, for me, this felt quite a lot like a spiritual home. It's perhaps I also confess I was learning to fly at the time, and it's a university that's built on an airfield, and it's a functioning airfield, and the aerospace department is still world class. So yeah, it wasn't bad that I was actually able to fly in and out and do my lessons there as well. But that was in my lunch break. But what Cranfield did teach me as a management school was how to teach. And I don't mean teach as in standing up in front of students. I'd learned a lot about that already in Sussex, and Brighton, and the various courses we ran. But Cranfield has a very powerful business school and a very busy management school, management development facility, which was essentially running short courses, tailored courses for companies. And so I would spend probably half my week in there, and all sorts of different companies from different sectors would come through, public and private sector organizations, and I'd have to somehow give them the innovation message in about a day and a half. They're a pretty tough audience. Their companies are paying a lot of money. They're expecting at the limit, at least to be kept awake, entertained, but ideally to be challenged and to take away something useful. And I learned a lot. I wouldn't say I was very good at it when I started, but at the end of that, I think I'd honed my skills at working with that audience. And again, back to ways of communicating the message. But I was very fortunate while I was at Cranfield to be invited to participate in something called AIM, which was the Advanced Institute for Management Research. This was an attempt by particularly the research council that was funding management research to somehow bridge the connection gap. They were concerned that they were funding a lot of management research that didn't find its way into practice. And the brilliant idea, brilliant for people like me, was rather than fund more projects, what about if we funded people? So a kind of virtual institute was set up, and I was one of the very lucky fellows, which basically gave us a budget, gave us some travel money, gave us some research staff, the chance to take our ideas, but we had to connect to practice. And that was a great challenge. It meant that we had to not only do good research and be judged by our peers, but also make sure that it did find its way into practice in a number of different ways. And I was very proud, amongst other things, that something that we tried at Centrum originally was setting up communities of practice with companies where they would learn with us and with each other about how to move something forward. We started this particularly with continuous improvement, quality improvement in companies. But working with AIM, big interest then was Clayton Christensen and the whole disruptive innovation story. We set up something called the Discontinuous Innovation Forum. And that brought together many companies in the UK. With AIM, I was able to replicate that eventually in 14 countries. I say I'm talking about a team of people. But this model of getting companies to share their learning, sometimes coming together internationally. And there was a big forum last week in Copenhagen. You may have come across if you read the trade press, but it's called the Innovation Leaders Forum. It's the biggest in the world. About 700 companies came. That grew through the guy who ran the Danish component of this AIM thing, that grew out of that. And I think for me, that was something that AIM taught me, how to find different new ways to connect to practice. One of the other things we did, and that moved me to Imperial, was look at the big challenges in innovation. And one of the biggest is, does any of the research we do at universities actually contribute to making the economy better? And the research councils were keen on grand challenges. And the one we took up at Imperial, along with 4 other universities, was the Innovation and Productivity Grand Challenge, which was great fun. But for me, it was particularly powerful because I ran that. I was the director, and basically was coordinating about 35 researchers spread across 5 institutions. That taught me a lot of lessons, again, about coordination, research management, but what you can achieve at scale if you can get all the bits to be greater than the sum of the parts. So I learned a lot about emergent properties in large groups. And I know, Howie, with the complex products thing, you did something similar when you were running that venture. So yeah, going to different places, you pick up different things. But for me, it's doing the same thing, but in different contexts. And they challenge you in different ways. They enable you in different ways.
Thanks, John. One of the things that all of the episodes of this In Conversation series has touched upon is the future for the sector and how our feelings are about it. And many of the people who've come before us in this series, I think, have been rather pessimistic about that, perhaps reflecting the state of the world today. I know I'm fairly pessimistic and have to say that after 50 years in higher education, I mean, people don't get life sentences for murder that last that long, but I'm disturbed about what I perceive is the commodification of learning, which fortunately I think in our careers we were able to avoid. Sort of things. I also have concerns in terms of, we have fads in methodology, which doesn't mean fads are a bad thing, but I have concerns in terms of this love affair that seems to be going on with big data at the moment. Almost every PhD you see in our field is using big data. I'm sure there is a role for it as a methodology, but I have concerns in terms of how it's being used and what the analysis and results actually mean, sort of thing. I'm hoping that you can give us some more positive views of the future. I've had the high sign from the organizers that we're running towards the end of the hour, and there's one other thing I want to squeeze in, but if you could reflect on terms of how you see the future going, and whether there's stuff that you're optimistic about.
Yeah, I'll try. I share with you. I mean, I think we've both been incredibly lucky to have been in the game when it was enormous fun. I mean, I've been as excited and stimulated in these later years as I have early on. But I think it has become harder. And the pessimism I can share, the slight concern, I mean, I think many of the things you've alluded to, particularly in a context like the UK, where we're perhaps too heavily assessed from outside and squeezed. But as someone who was a research director in a couple of institutions, I'm becoming more optimistic that push towards research, and narrowly defined as what you can get published in top journals is beginning to swing the other way. As you probably gathered from everything I've said, for me, I think it's really important that universities don't forget their core mission is still to help people learn, and that involves the teaching side. And of course, we've seen now the move back towards understanding how important teaching is and how we've got to innovate that, not least the COVID experience. And also, we've been looking very much at this question of impact. And I think the UK assessments have just come out. I was on one of the research assessment panels back in 2000, and we didn't even think about impact then, whereas now it counts for a lot. And it forces you to think about not just the great ideas and were they methodologically well-derived, but how are they going to change the world in a positive direction? So I'm optimistic that that pendulum swing is still coming back in the right direction. I'm also enormously optimistic when I see the new generation coming through. I was mentioning to some people, I'm a visiting professor in Norway, and we had a faculty meeting last week in a fjord. Well, of course you do in Norway, you've got plenty of fjords, but they were also trying to integrate a faculty that, because of COVID, hasn't physically met for 2 years. And they had a research slam. And the research slam was a great way of presenting research ideas. It was kind of a challenge, not just give a paper in 5 minutes, but get people's attention and share your ideas in 5 minutes. So lots of innovative ways of presenting. But what was being looked at? Responsible innovation. And that goes right back to when Chris and the others set up SPRU and other institutions. Innovation isn't a value-free thing. We've got to be really careful to think about what changes and why, and are we doing this responsibly? That's alive and well and thriving in many of these things. The sustainability agenda, Rafi's done a lot, and I know in his talk when he was in this series, he talked around that. But sustainability, how we look after our planet, hugely important, and that's a big challenge. And then I think some very interesting directions, which open up new frontiers. What are we going to do about artificial intelligence? You alluded to it earlier, when potentially the whole innovation process could be automated, the decision-making and the creation and so on. So there's some interesting space just opening up there, which I find exciting, because it means that there's as many challenges in innovation now as there ever were. But yeah, I'm an optimist, but actually I think there's still plenty to play for. And it's a great space to be.
Thanks, John. Now I'd like to end this part of the episode with something a little different. Now, there is this, I think it's an urban myth, maybe it's true, but it's often said that one is never more than 10 feet away from a rat. I'm not sure I believe it. I live on the 5th floor of a building and I've never actually seen a rat in the building. However, what is true is that John Bessant is never more than 10 feet away from a musical instrument. And this was not set up in terms of your, being surrounded by musical instruments. But I understand that you have another moniker, which is the singing professor. Could you tell us how you got the name, being the singing professor? And perhaps you'd be willing to give us an example?
Sure, I don't take much persuading. Well, the origins are very simple. I was with my wife at a conference about 2015, and the keynote was pretty average. And my wife and I were both moaning about it, and she said, well, do something different with a keynote. That's fine, and we could talk about it over coffee. But she then went to see the organizer of this conference and booked me a slot the next year in Helsinki to do something different. So I'm suddenly challenged. But what I thought, and I had my good friend with me who was helping, why not write some songs about innovation and perform them? And I have to say, I've been on many stages in front of thousands of people. I like public speaking, that's not a problem. But on this particular occasion in Helsinki, I was shaking because I thought this could go very badly wrong. It didn't. It was a lot of fun. We called it a sideways look at innovation. But it did make me think, actually, we could package up our knowledge and just present it in different ways. And that's what I've been doing, writing songs about innovation and inflicting them on the world. Most recently, it's been quite helpful because when I've been doing Zoom lectures, just to get students' attention, surprise them. Every 15 minutes, swing in a surprise. And of course, the first surprise, when I start singing, they really are jolted. So in the spirit of that, I'll happily share one of my greatest hits. If you want the rest, they're on my YouTube channel. But this is perhaps the one that perhaps fits most with this community. It's all about dynamic capability. And it does have a chorus, so you could sing along if you wanted. So here we go. Hope you can hear this all right. I'll just move my mic a bit closer. But, you like to think you're sitting on top of your technology. Your gadgets are smart and cool because you do lots of R&D. Your software's fast and your data's the best. Your packaging's cool, you can't forget all the rest. There's only one problem left at your door. Folks don't want your product no more. So you need dynamic capability. In innovation, it's got to be dynamic capability. At the heart of your philosophy, you can't rely on the old routines to deal with problems you've never seen. In innovation, the key to creation is keep on building up your dynamic capability. Dynamic capability. Dynamic capability. There you go. I won't inflict any more on you, but that's a sample.
John, thanks very much. We're going to be taking a break now, I understand, for 5 minutes and coming back then for, I'm not sure how they're going to do it, but responding is Joe and George, and then opening up to the rest of the audience for questions. So stay with us after. Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was really very fascinating to just see John to have that instrument and sing so beautifully that it just infused lots of good vibes into all of us. And as already announced, we will be having a 5 minute break, a very quick break. But before that, I would just like to invite Professor Carlota Perez to announce about the competition thing. So over to Professor Perez. And in the meanwhile, I will be also sharing the screen with the ad.
I think we can share the screen after the announcements. Let us see Professor Carlota.
Okay.
Wouldn't that be nice?
Okay.
Yeah.
You are on mute. Professor Carlota, you are on mute.
You're mute. Yeah.
Please unmute yourself.
Wasn't that fantastic? I mean, of course, one expected that from these two incredible people whom I did invite very early on and had fantastic results. Actually, you know, I would say that they were responsible for saving quite a few companies, not only for making some consultants be very successful in their lives, but also saving the many companies that these consultants saved, because that was the lost decade in Latin America. And Venezuela, because of oil, was able to survive a few more years. So those were the years when John and Howie and Richard and their team taught the so-called PI, and all those people are in very good positions now, thanks to that. But now I want to talk about something that is in their lives, which is Chris Freeman's influence. I think all of us who had the privilege of having Chris close and having him as a mentor will never forget it. I mean, it has changed our lives in all sorts of ways. He opened directions, and he also had a very strong ethical attitude towards innovation and towards technology and science, and of course society and policy and all that. And Rafi already mentioned this defense of whatever was right if you fulfill the conditions. He was also very demanding. Well, what we tried to do with this essay competition that I want to talk to you about in his honor, this is Chris Freeman's centenary year, 100 years from his birth. He died 12 years ago. So many people don't really know, especially the young are not acquainted with his work. And the idea with this competition is to get the young to have the opportunity to have a reason to go back and read Chris Freeman. So we put a little prize on it. If you win, you get 400 euros. If you win in one of the 7 categories, which I will list in a minute, you get 100 euros, but that's the least of it. The real prize is to get acquainted with Chris's thinking. And our idea was to do that with people who are either doing their PhDs, they're researchers now, or early researchers, like 3 years. 3 years ago, they did their PhD, that sort of cohort. So if you are in that cohort, please pay attention to this possibility. I guarantee you will like it, you will enjoy it, you will benefit from it. And you have 6 weeks, it's until the end of June. And you have 7 areas to choose from. I mean, just that list shows you what Chris was like. The list of topics, and they're not all there, but the list of topics we're putting here are topics where Chris made contributions. So they are development, growth. Now that people are talking about degrowth, it'd be interesting to see what Chris was saying about that. Systems of innovation, long waves, which is where I work, of course, technological revolutions and how they evolve and they influence. Science policy, actually not just science policy, technology policy also, but the whole thing. Then science, society, and nature, which obviously includes this whole climate change thing. Innovation management, which is what we've been talking about today with great fun. And so those would be the areas. And all you have to write is 1,500 words, but that's the least of the job. The job is to read Chris, and he has a webpage where all his work is listed, most of his work, I think almost all of it. That's just freemanchris.org. And the whole thing is sponsored by Globelix. If you look at this, it's in Twitter, in my Twitter, Carlotta Press Perez. It's like having a Perez without the E's in the middle, at Carlotta Press Perez, if you want. It's in my webpage. The explanation in a PDF is in the Globelix webpage. And I hope most of you who fall in this category of being PhD students or whatever will take the opportunity to meet Chris Freeman. You will find it a wonderful experience. It has been for all of us who knew him, and reading his work, you will discover a lot of things that are useful for your work today and tomorrow, and for the possibility of changing society for the better, which was his main objective and what guided all his work. So please do think about it, do act upon it. We'd love to have you enter this competition, and we'd love you to win. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the second invitation is from In Conversation series. And the next series we are going to have on 22nd of June, 2022. And in that, we will be having Professor Bente Wall interviewed by Jan Fagerbo. So that would be, again, a very amazing thing not to miss. So please join us again on 22nd of June. And I think it's about 5 minutes over, and we should be just getting back to the work in the second part of our program of the series, and I think we should continue. And I again welcome Professor Howie Rush to continue with the second part of the series. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, do people get a break now, or do we go directly to the respondents now?
I think the break is over. So
Okay.
we are going to the business now.
Okay.
Yeah.
We have two respondents to the conversation that we've just had, and this is a bit of an old club. I mean, we're all good friends for many, many years. We've got, I don't know, have you guys flipped a coin as to who's going to go first? Or have you a preference?
I'm happy for Joe to go first. I don't mind.
That's very generous, George. Thank you. Yeah.
We've got, we have Joe Tidd, Professor Joe Tidd, from the University of Sussex, and Joe, of course, has had a long career as well. I think you were at Imperial at one time before that, but is one of John's co-author on the bestseller, Managing Innovation. And that'll be followed by Dr. George Sakouras, who is the current director of Centrum. And we're delighted to have you both joining us. So, Joe, I think you're up first.
Okay. I've got a couple of connected questions, and then I'll pass over to George, and then finally we'll let everyone else have a Q&A session. So the first question really is sort of, if you like, the location of innovation studies, and I think that sort of moved on. So I think in the ye olde days that we've been discussing so far, the locus or loci were in sort of interdisciplinary centres like Centrim, Technology Policy Units, SPRU and such like, which often were sort of standalone units, crossing different disciplines, etc., etc. But I think increasingly you have to accept that it's now based in mostly, particularly in Europe and the US, in business schools. I think this is good and bad. I think it's potentially good in terms of resources and intellect and talent, potentially bad because it tends to be based in a particular faculty or discipline. So I think one of the questions is, and I think it sort of relates to the collaboration that we did back in the mid-90s for the book, the initial book, came out in 97 with Keith, when we're all at different institutions. I can't, going back to Howie's nomadic description of your career, I can't remember where you were then, John, but I know in the mid-90s I was at Imperial, Keith was at Sprue, but I can't honestly remember where you were at that point. Do you know? Can you remember?
It was the tail end of my Centrum years before I moved to Cranfield. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, it's on that sort of cusp of things. Yeah. Anyway, so we were actually different institutions and such like that. But basically, long story short, we felt that despite successes in previous sort of work, research, and teaching, that there wasn't a sort of non-North American sort of text that drew upon, and this is the important part, that drew upon what we believed jointly, me, John and Keith and others, from what I guess a grand title would be innovation studies, whatever you want to call it. So it wasn't just about innovation management. It wasn't just certainly about innovation policy and other sort of variations on the innovation theme. That there was this feeling that we weren't being served well, partly because of the North American bias of teaching and research in the area, but more about it was coming out of business schools from North America, and they've had a distinctly disciplinary or functional spin. So some of the existing texts were very manufacturing centric, others were very sort of Silicon Valley entrepreneurship startup centric, and we were very unsatisfied that the interdisciplinary nature wasn't being reflected in sort of teaching and texts and such like. So one of the motives for that initial collaboration between John, myself and Keith was to draw upon what we would call, I guess, innovation studies, which went beyond simply management or business into the social domain, into policy and such like. And how successful we are is another issue, but we're on the 7th iteration of that particular collaboration with various spin-offs along the way. So I'll try to get to a question, John, now, rather than a sort of long preamble, is that things have moved on, I think, not necessarily in a positive or a negative sense, but they've certainly evolved since those early days where we're thinking, okay, basically, is the locus of innovation studies, if we want to call it that, now, because it's more based in business schools and worse than that, I think, in particular faculties, is this problematic for the sort of current and future scholars of research? Because leading on to some of your points about publication in particularly the highly rated management journals, this has always been a problem in the past, but now, particularly new faculty, it's a serious problem in the sense of what are their outputs, what are their venues in terms of conferences and particularly publications, given this more narrow functional or disciplinary focus on innovation. So things like research policy were founded and R&D management to try to fix some of those problems, but maybe with the exception of research policy, tend not to be highly ranked in this usual business school, beauty contests and such like, for the very reason that they are interdisciplinary. So therefore, the pressure is on young faculty to identify themselves as either strategy, organizational development, et cetera, marketing and such like. So the question is, given how things have evolved in the locus where it's based, it tends not to be based so much in interdisciplinary centers, maybe with the exception of literally a handful worldwide. It's more and more in business faculties and particularly in certain disciplines. What can we do to try to open this up and to draw more upon what we would call a more diverse interdisciplinary knowledge base?
Wow, great question. And from my point, I absolutely agree with your description of the way that things have evolved. Sometime back, and I was reflecting on this very recently, sometime back at Sprue, Martin Bell and I were asked to put a report together, and it was for the World Bank, but particularly for an Indian institution which built infrastructure. And it built infrastructure like bridges and roads, but it thought maybe human resources might be a bit of infrastructure. So long story short, they were interested in management of innovation. It's called management of technology at the time, but that was it. And so part of what we did was a review of, well, where did this field come from? Go right back to the beginnings. Where is it now? And this was in the mid-90s. and where's it going? So where did it all come from? Well, actually, you're dead right. It began in little pockets. Little bits of it, the engineering schools, places like MIT and Cambridge and so on, would look at the problems of industrial engineering, quality, productivity, process innovation. Business schools would look at marketing challenges, business strategy. R&D is a very small subset at that time. So you have these little pockets gradually converging. And then this very relatively newcomer, the small business community, how do you start ventures, sort of what became the entrepreneurship thing. So it wasn't really until the late 80s that this became a kind of coherent thing. And then we began to see courses. And Sprue was a pioneer, but there were others. And then it took off. So there were some sort of golden periods when it was a very topical thing and it sucked lots of people in and it was a very hot field. Sadly, I think you're right, that actually the decline of those interdisciplinary centers has meant we're going back into the silos again. And whilst there are some wonderful bits of work on the psychology of innovation or its sociology, it's no longer in the spaces where you can have what for me was such a joy when I was a young researcher, the interchange in a Sprue seminar on a Friday afternoon when all these different psychological, social, economic, all these perspectives were coming in. So I think that's a risk. And then it does translate into where we publish. I've sat on a couple of the assessment panels for research in the UK, and the problem is which journals are people publishing in, which fields are going to be important. And the lists that have emerged around that assessment process have, if anything, reinforced that. And so you're right, young researchers, where do I publish is the question, but there aren't the interdisciplinary homes that there used to be, or anything like as many of them. So yeah, having said I was an optimist, Howie, I think I'm feeling slightly pessimistic about that. I think the advantage, and to spare your blushes, Joe, but of journals like IJIM, International Journal of Innovation Management, there is still an attempt by journal editors to draw things from different places, to be methodologically diverse, not just to focus on narrow quantitative things, but to try and offer a spectrum. But it's difficult, and there aren't enough journals, there aren't enough places. So I think that is one of the challenges for our field. On the plus side, I suppose the investment, if you take it overall, is still as healthy as ever. It's just being spread out across many more places rather than focused on one or two. Maybe in this era of open innovation, we're wanting virtual interdisciplinary collaboration rather than the physical one. Maybe that's the positive future direction. But yeah, slightly pessimistic view, but that's where we are. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, on the more optimistic note, without sort of promoting journals down, I think also that filling in some of those gaps, particularly in terms of the communities of practice, are some of the established conference ones. You know, most of us here know ISPIM, have been to a few, or are sort of standing features of that. And I think they often help individuals in different faculties to realise that others are adopting more interdisciplinary approaches to the challenges.
I mean, I guess maybe just a tail piece. If I had I often ask people in my interviews, if I was your fairy godmother and I gave you one wish, what would you wish for? So it kind of gets a projective response. But my response to that question would be, where I came in the game, there was a joint committee between the two big research councils funding research, and it picked up essentially that interdisciplinary space. It didn't know quite what to do with it. The budget wasn't huge, but it was a space where this could be explored and risks could be taken. We've now got in the UK quite a lot of separation. The roles of research council are quite tightly specified. In a sense, the innovation story and the interdisciplinary nature of it kind of falls in there. So I'd reinvent a version of the joint committee.
Okay. And following on from that, before I pass over to George, is this, I guess, one of the strands that are distinctive in your career is this idea of the links between, if you like, research, teaching and practice, that you're sort of trying to close the loop, and that's partly the rationale for Centrium and other roles and institutions that you've been active in. And I would applaud that. But going back to, if you like, current sort of pressures on faculty, where you have trying to close that loop between research, teaching and practice becomes even more problematic because often faculty will be hired, say, on a teaching contract, or there may be pure researchers who don't teach or practice, because the idea is you get, the depth of knowledge and the focus. You don't get, quote, distracted by awkward things like companies and students and such like, but you get lots of research assessments. And I think even perhaps more problematic in the UK and some of the other Northern European assessment frameworks, which you just mentioned, John, is not just the assessment of, if you like, publications and outputs in a narrow sense, in a narrow disciplinary sense, but I think they also have adopted a very narrow idea of what impact is. So I think you're right in terms of often there's more scrutiny about value for money, what's the social and particularly economic impact. But in my experience in the UK and other assessment regimes, particularly in Northern Europe, is that even that is narrowly defined. So they want to have a central paper or papers in a decent journal, their definition, and then you have to demonstrate the flow from that. Ironically, it's a linear model of innovation because the economists devised framework, but basically you have to identify the paper or papers from which that research came from and how that was, quote, disseminated to industry, unquote. So this seemed to be almost the polar opposite of the career that you've been describing, of having this closed loop learning between research, teaching and practice, and you may start anywhere in that loop. So what are your views on, if you like, the future of impact and impact assessment on trying to follow your example of having that closed loop sort of action learning approach?
Yeah, another great question. And trying not to be too pessimistic, I think what's been good about the gradual evolution of the impact story in the UK model, which I think is emulated by many others, what's been good is the gradual evolution of how we measure impact. And hopefully that trend will continue. We've got much better at it, still got a long way to go, but we are now recognizing there will be a lag. There will be lots of transmission belt activities. It's not just a solo, my ideas have this impact, but ideas flow through people. So I think there's something important there, and we're beginning to understand and take into account that. I think my big concern these days is the nature, particularly of academic jobs, which are you are either a teacher, education family, or a researcher. You use the word pure research. God, in a sense, for me, that's going in totally the wrong direction. Universities are about setting knowledge in motion, making these things happen, and their biggest impact still is the outflow of people who have been, I was going to say educated, it's like a process you do something, but people who have learned something, that's the biggest impact. So the teaching role is hugely important, but teaching uninformed by research isn't very good. So it's for me, the vision of the rounded academic would be somebody who is doing all these things. And indeed, we've got this activity with ISPIM now, which I'm pleased about. We call it the Future Educators thing. We're working with PhDs and early career academics who realize life isn't just about research. Most of what you're probably going to get paid for if you take an academic job is going to be teaching of some kind. So I would love to see that come back. The pessimist in me sees forces which are still pushing quite hard for further separation. And I'm not optimistic in that sense, unfortunately.
Okay, thanks, John. George.
Now, before we move to George,
sorry, Howie.
I'll be over to you in a second, George. I'd just like to point out, and I think it was important that Joe brought in these issues related to multidisciplinarity and the like. One of the things that I forgot to mention about John was that he created, of course, his own multidisciplinarity, because originally having been a chemical engineer, late in life, he went back and did another degree in psychology. So one can get it in the same individual as well, and maybe that's the way we have to go. I particularly like, John, your answer in terms of the if you had a fairy godmother, god person, I probably should say these days, in terms of what your wish would be. I have to say mine's a lot more mundane than that. If I had one wish, it would be able to sleep in economy in an airplane. George, we're going to move over to you now. I mentioned that George is the, and has been for some years, the director of Centrum. George also had a role as the head of the ProfitNet program and several others. And this program, which was aimed at supporting small and medium-sized firms, and thousands of firms joined this, and it was licensed to many different countries as well, came from the ideas of the networking activities that Centrum had actually researched over the years. So, George, I'd like to hand over to you for your responses and questions for John.
Thank you, Howie. Thank you. Let me start with a comment before I put my questions. And I have to say that I'm indebted to both John and Howie. I joined Centrum as a young researcher. And one of the first things I learned by being in Centrum is that you learn a lot by talking to practitioners and being part of their conversations. And what was coming with this naive idea that, when you try to deal with the intellectually strong issues or issues of high intellectual nature, the practitioners may be only useful as source of information in a typical research way. John and Howie have taught me that by going in their conversations and trying to be part of their conversations and integrate them in conversation, you are learning a lot. And I think this is the idea came from for ProfitNet that I mentioned before, trying to push this agenda of making impact out of our research. We came up with the idea, which proved to be very successful, that the best way to communicate your ideas to a group of practitioners, to close the loop, to make the link between practice and research, is get the practitioners to talk to each other and give feedback to each other. So once this process is on, once they start talking to each other, they open up to the possibility of listening some intellectual ideas, the research outcome, and the process ends up having practitioners that have an extremely high absorptive capacity. And this is something that we develop on the back of the learning journey I have been with both John and Howie. So I'm indebted in life to them for giving me these ideas. Now, the big question is how we move on from now on. What do we do in the future to promote the field of our studies, which are passionate about, and this is innovation, entrepreneurship, and all the rest of that. And probably the direction that I would like to take in my questions, risking to be accused of pessimism, which I don't want to be, is probably really some of the difficult questions we need to tackle. Some of the difficult questions we have to tackle as a community of academics. And I picked up a couple of difficult questions that I think, one for the field of innovation practitioners in the business context, and another for the policymakers. So I would like to pose that to you, John, and attempt to get a response from you. The first idea is if you feel we have explored sufficiently the idea of forced innovation. And by saying that, a most typical example is, according to some people, the current situation with the electrification of cars and what Tesla is trying to do. So there are some people, I'm not sure I adopted their theories or not, but I hear them when they're criticizing Tesla. They say Tesla has been developed on the basis of environmental sustainability agenda. It's good for the planet, less CO2 and everything. But if you project electric cars like Teslas and say 50% of the drivers, of the global drivers riding an electric car, or even 70%, 80%, the environmental issues we're going to have to find the minerals to produce the batteries and all the rest of the environmental problems will be huge. And plus the criticism goes on, what the electrification of the cars is doing, it just passes the problem for the owners of the small cars into the generators of electricity. I'm willing to have a conversation about these issues. It's definitely interesting, but I still have to see a comprehensive effort to deal with this idea of false innovation, which I suppose the underlying assumption there is innovation by definition a good force? Is there circumstances or conditions that for innovation can be false or can be taken to undesirable effects? That's my first question. And I have a second question, John, for you to remind, which is about the policy-making field. And of course, following our discussions and our activities, our publications, all of us are very keen to have innovation policies. So policies that support innovation people to exercise innovation and develop innovation activities. And again, this is one of the most fundamental dilemmas inherited in these innovation policies that has not been addressed, has not been resolved. And this is the tension between, on the one hand, funding innovation, which is inevitably going to involve a significant percentage of failure. There is no innovation that delivers a high percentage of success, we know that. But on the other hand, arguing about accountability and the need for accountability because it's taxpayers' money. How can we have an efficient and successful innovation policy if we don't allow a sufficient number of failures to go through in giving real meaning to the term innovation? I know it's probably some of the questions that cannot be resolved within the context of a discussion, but given your wealth of experience, John, and the huge track record you have in research, I would be delighted to listen to your first responses to these questions.
Wow, thanks, George. That will keep us going for a whole afternoon and longer, but I'll give you my very brief answers. And the easiest response to anything to do with cars is to throw it in Joe's direction, because I defer totally. But I think what I would take from your example, though, is a big question. But in some ways, it goes back to where I first came in. This notion of responsibility, of thinking ahead, of technology assessment, as we used to call it, or innovation assessment, that's got a long history. And SPRU was one of the first institutions, but it's not alone. There were others. And importantly, there were tools and techniques developed to help think about what's it going to mean and what might be the unanticipated consequences. I mentioned my dear mentor supervisor, Sidney Gregory. When I was still an undergraduate, I had to do a project and I wrote about DDT, because for me, it suddenly was, oh, wow, this thing that we as engineers thought was a rather good thing because it was going to make productivity in agriculture rocket, this insecticide, it's not such a good thing. Who knew? Well, maybe we didn't think about it at that time. So in a sense, I was, as an undergraduate, touched with, we need to think about questions of technology more fundamentally. And are we being responsible? Now, if you reel that forward, and as I said, my first job was in a unit like SPRU, the technology policy unit, trying to ask these kinds of questions about the electronics revolution. If you go to today, part of my optimistic response for the future, when Howie asked me, I do see a lot more discussion of responsible innovation. And whilst the name has changed, it's the same stuff. It's the same wine in the bottles. My dear friend, Richard Owen, who was at Exeter with me for a while, we did a book together, but he offers, for example, a very used framework, which the EU and the UK research councils have adopted, which says, don't just do research and innovate. Let's ask some questions, some fundamental questions about, have we thought about it? Have we anticipated? Are we inclusive? Have we got all the sort of stakeholders chipping in their views and their anxieties? Have we got something which actually is adaptive, can be shaped, or is it an all or nothing thing? You know, these are big questions we've known about a long time, but I like to think that that is still alive and well. And that would be my sort of way of dealing with your first challenge, is to promote more around the responsible innovation approach. I think your second one on policy, my big concern over many, many years of looking at policies, so much of it defaults to the usual short-term within a government's lifetime kind of policy, and it's usually handing out money or reducing the money you take away in taxes. That's a very simplistic view. I'm not an economist, but in a sense, what's often missing is, for me, two big things. One of them is consistency, and some of the evaluations that we've done over the years of places like Sweden, policy, and I know about manufacturing quite well, has been pretty consistent for decades. So you know where you stand in industry, and equally you'll then move with government to try and adapt to cope with the changing environment. Whereas I have to say the experiences in somewhere like the UK, it's all change every 5 years, and probably informed by civil servants who don't necessarily know too much about innovation or industry. That's perhaps a cynical view, but that's it. So I think consistency is important, and connection. And that's really been perhaps a theme we've talked about throughout this afternoon. It's about understanding what it's like on the ground. What Howie and I worked on in the early studies around the government's, for its time, quite good microelectronics policies was essentially, how is industry working with this new technology, which is a big risk, but potentially a big winner? How is it learning about it? What can we do to help them learn? And one of the things the government saw was the need for an intermediary scheme, a consultancy scheme funded at the level of feasibility studies to help businesses make what would then be their decision. So that idea of connectivity as well as consistency would be important. But in terms of failures, we've just been through COVID, and we've managed to find a way to blow our way through billions of pounds in COVID-related loans, many of which were for entrepreneurial ventures. So we know how to fail. Whether we know how to fail intelligently is another matter. And I had a PhD student at Exeter, and if nothing else, he deserved the award for his PhD title. It was about intelligent failure. And I think there's a whole field to be explored there. But yeah, thanks for the questions, George.
Any other points, George, that you want to raise?
Oh, I plenty, but I don't want to abuse my time.
Okay.
If you tell me, I'm going to throw one more question, John. What can be done to increase our impact on the real world? What is the top 2 things you will do to increase the impact of our community to the real world?
Oh, well, nice, easy question, George. Thank you. Well, very, very simply, it's to talk, to engage. I mean, we hear a lot of rhetoric about engaged academic, engaged scholarship, but get stuck in. But that's coming from an engineer who can't imagine it done any other way. I can't think about sort of armchair theorizing, or for that matter, a world of practice that isn't prepared to listen if somebody's got a good story to tell about a possibly better way. But it is about the act. If we ask, what can we do? Get out there. There being the policy world, there being the company world, there being the public sector, wherever, get out there.
Well, thanks both to Joe and George for those contributions. I'm indebted to the organizers who have been going through the chats and other ways of people sending in questions and combining them in terms of themes. So I've got a number of questions from the audience, and if I hope those people will forgive me, because I'm going to, with the help of the organizers who have helped to summarize some of the longer ones, just present to John for his thoughts on some of the themes that people are raising and combining some of these. Several of the comments that have come in had been about public sector innovation. I mean, very frequently when we talk about innovation, it's presumed that it's the preserve of the private sector. And, people are interested in hearing in terms of, what's seen as a desperate need for institutional innovation as well. And about, what's your experience in terms of public sector innovation. I mentioned in the introduction that one of the places that you are a fellow is the UK Government Government Academy, Sunningdale, as well as the fact that for the last 10 years or so, both you and I have spent a fair bit of our research time and participation time working with different humanitarian organizations. Because of our perceived need that, particularly in humanitarian relief, there are great opportunities for innovation to help meet the desperate needs that are presenting themselves today. So, John, would you like to comment in terms of the public sector innovation and institutional innovation, what your experience has been, and what you think the potential might be?
The potential is huge. I mean, that's the easy one to answer. And I'd certainly roll in not just the public sector, but the not-for-profit, the third sector, because that's a big chunk and a hugely important chunk, because it's about social innovation rather than necessarily commercial gain, but hugely important. I guess the potential's there without question. The difficulties are much more, how can I put it? It's more difficult to be an innovator in those contexts. And for me, it's because if you take the private sector, crudely characterized, you're trying to balance risk and reward. And it's a seesaw, but that's what you're trying to do. In the public sector, in the not-for-profit, you've got a third thing to balance, which is reliability. You can't not deliver education. You can't not deliver healthcare. So in a sense, you've got to keep things balanced much more in a much more difficult context. Add to that the fact that particularly in the public sector, you're very often in the public eye, and newspapers like the Daily Mail over here are quick to point the finger when you try something and it goes wrong. So there's a kind of endemic risk aversion in the sector at this institution level. It's hard to innovate. You probably don't get many bouquets if you're successful, and you get lots of brickbats if you're unsuccessful. So it's a more difficult context. That's not to say it's not possible to innovate. And one of the joys is, particularly at the local level, to see wonderful examples of sometimes radical innovation, certainly plenty of continuous improvement going on in those sectors. I've been doing a lot of research recently on collaboration platforms, which are essentially ways of bringing the suggestion box into the 21st century, and using powerful software to get people's ideas and implement them. And whilst the private sector have embraced this well, there's been some amazing examples from cancer treatment centers in America, from big hospitals in the UK, from universities, dare I say it. So in a sense, innovation can happen in these contexts, and does. So we can learn from that. I think there are at least two reasons why we could do more. One is, particularly for the public sector, some consistency of the context. What I hear when I talk to people, particularly in the health sector here, we change the game every 5 minutes. So it's just get down and get on with the job. It's very hard to innovate when you're constantly being pointed in different strategic directions. I think the other thing which we definitely can do something about is capacity building. So many people are in these things not because they get particularly well paid, but because they want to make a difference, whether it's nursing, whether it's going into the charity sector, whatever. People are there because they care. That's a wonderful thing, and they're full of great ideas. The danger, and I'm sure you saw this when you were on the board of the Humanitarian Innovation Fund, the danger is you will have a lot of heart, but sometimes not enough head. Because we do know innovation's a tough game, but we know a lot about it. So for me, if I were to take the body of knowledge we've accumulated and learned to teach, perhaps the most urgent recipients for education, learning how to do it, would be those innovators in the public and the third sector. But certainly the potential is huge. And as I say, the good news is there's lots of good examples.
Thanks, John. Another one of the themes that have been coming up in the chats has been about some of our early work on research and technology organizations, where we developed, in fact, a benchmarking methodology for how one evaluates them. But in particular, what some of the people are interested in is, do they still have a role? Do the government-funded research and technology organizations, which at the time when we were looking at, when national systems of innovation was a popular theme and approach within the discipline, and we'd look at seeing what role they played there. But the questions are being raised in the chats about, are there still a role? And also perhaps the differences between these government-funded organizations in the UK as compared to in other countries. I remember myself that one of the conclusions we drew at the time when we were writing our book on this was that certainly within the UK, government-funded RTOs had the potential to invest heavily in areas that were loss leaders, perhaps, that required large capital inputs that the private sector were not willing to invest in at that time. And that wasn't, we saw perceived as an important role. On the other hand, when we looked at RTOs in other countries, we saw that in fact that they were fulfilling a niche within and I'll call it an ecosystem, because I think that national systems of innovation idea has evolved into an understanding of innovation ecosystems, that they were fulfilling a role where there was a lack of expertise within the private sector. And so that they were forming an intermediary role in terms of doing those. But have you got any reflections in terms on whether there still is a role to play for these sorts of organizations today?
Yes, and in fact, looking back over that work we did, I think there's probably another piece of research and another book in it in terms of the evolution of that. I guess a couple of comments that I think there has always been a role for government or government-supported institutions that are focal points for research and development, perhaps with a strong emphasis on the applied end of it. But I think that there's plenty of evidence that those institutions have played a big role in the past. Think about Mike Hobday's work on South Korea and how important some of the state-funded institutions were there in terms of creating the infrastructure intellectually that allowed giants like LG and Samsung to emerge. So there's something there. I think the danger is those institutions can sometimes become simply, oh, we'll fund this because then we've got one of these, and they're kind of what I'd call trophy institutes trying to do really irrelevant or glamorous high-ticket item projects without necessarily connecting. I think the message certainly we took from the original research, and I would still subscribe to that today, is that once again, it's connectivity, that those institutes that are well embedded in their sector or in the user base for the particular technology they're working on, and are therefore understanding not just the science and technology, but its application. That becomes really important. And I guess the role model still is that, for me, at least the Fraunhofer Institutes in Germany, which have been consistent, they've been around a long time, which are still growing. There are still new ones being founded, which exist with government support, but not government feather bedding. So they very much have a ticket which says, we'll give you a start, but you've got to earn your own keep, which they earn from industry. And occasionally, if you're lucky enough to invent the MP3, from royalties, which was perhaps the lucky one in that institute. But the Fraunhofer Institutes essentially play, I think, a critical role, and they're still a good role model for others. They're very applied. They're focused. They're not trying to do all things to all men and women. They're basically trying to be something there. And if you need another one to look at a different technology, you set up a new one rather than one to try and do everything. They're very connected to universities. They're often in the same town, often with joint appointments, joint PhD projects, and so on. So they kind of leverage the university infrastructure. It's a great model. There are other variations on it. I think we've tried to do it in the UK with things like the catapult centres with some success. I think we've moved towards the right model. But yes, to answer the original question, there's definitely a role. It mustn't just be a trophy thing. It must be focused and relevant. It's got to be connected. And it's probably not going to do too much in terms of groundbreaking science unless it's a really important field, in which case you'd probably want to create a different kind of shared research program rather than an institute. But perhaps one other comment, it's very relevant. One of the organizations we looked at, Howie, was an organization called PERA, which used to be all about production engineering research, but came to be a vehicle to focus, particularly for the small engineering companies, a kind of R&D capability. So if you're a small company, you can't afford to do it on your own, but you can connect. And PIRA did that for engineering companies. And then there was a government policy called SuperNet, which said, well, actually, this model might work for many others. And so what PIRA did was effectively brokerage, intermediary, saying, well, we do have, or we had at the time, many good institutions, good research RTOs in a variety of sectors and technologies. And we've got a lot of smaller firm requirements. How do we connect the two? And it was a fascinating program. And I still talk about it a lot because my next door neighbor used to be the director of PIRA. So we often reminisce over a drink or two about that. But I think that's a good example where it's not just institutes to push the frontier or to work with the bigger companies. It's also to move the knowledge base to the smaller users. But yes, absolutely, there's a role.
I think that one of the things that I've noted in terms of the changes within RTOs, and very pleased to see that in the humanitarian sector, it's gaining steam, is the fact that these RTOs publicly funded are providing an infrastructure, providing a space for entrepreneurs and potential users to come in and use that space, use the technologies available within the space, and use the advisory services of those institutions to actually, facilitate them developing new ideas. And I think, what I think you mentioned the Fraunhofers, what I think they call little Joes are an example of that. But I've seen this also in many countries around the world that UNICEF do it, UNESCO do it, and it's good to see that some of these international organizations adopting these technologies. We're running towards the end of the 2 hours. I've still got quite a few issues or themes that have been raised. We won't be able to get to them all, and I apologize. I will be sending, I'm sure the organizers will make them available to John as well, so that if he's so inclined, might respond individually. It has the names of different people. But one of them that might be a nice one to draw a close on is related to something that you were talking about, or you raised in passing in terms of looking at the future, was the fact that innovation is not a value-free process, and that we have they would like to know what sort of are the key values that need to be embedded in innovation alongside responsibilities. So have you got any thoughts in terms of the social side in terms of benefits to it? I mean, very often we only look at or people only perceive innovation as being relayed to the economy. But of course, we know that value can be created in many, many different parts of society. So, would you like to expand on that part of your vision or hope for the future?
Yes, though I'm in danger of sounding then like I'm up in a pulpit giving a sermon more.
There's not enough time. There's not enough time.
Not enough time for a sermon. That's good. Thank you.
Don't worry. Keep it short.
No, I guess it's 2 comments. One was to reiterate again the need for frameworks and process. It's all very well to say, yes, we need a more benign set of values and we need to think about innovation. But going right back to the origins of Sprue and others, we do need frameworks and process. I think responsible innovation, and please Google it, there's a lot written around it. There's even a journal of responsible innovation. There is a framework, there's a way of thinking and a set of questions and tools which belong to that. So it's not going to happen just by willing it into place. I think the second, I'm not sure whether Google were ever serious about it, but do no harm. It's the kind of, that's quite an important value embedded in that. And actually, I do remember years ago, we were running a master's program jointly with Roy Rothwell and others, working with companies. And we got people to say, where do you come from? And companies were talking about, well, I come from this big chocolate maker and we make those lovely chocolates you love to eat at the weekend and so on. Or we do this. the guy from British Aerospace Missiles Division wasn't too happy about that. And it wasn't perhaps a surprise that he left the company shortly after. There's a bit of a clash if your innovation efforts are devoted to making things that are going to kill people. Now, I say that, but not naively. We're in a situation now where, these are not simple questions. So I'm not for a moment saying we don't need it, but we've got to be quite clear what's going on and what the underlying values are. If I'm asked to sort of think optimistically for the future, I'd love to see a lot more of social innovation values creeping in. What pleases me in terms of the students, particularly the undergraduates, and we have a big push now at Exeter around entrepreneurship, they don't particularly want to do their entrepreneurship project, the test project, to make a lot of money. Most of them want to do it to make a difference. And I think that's been perhaps the nicest thing about innovation going right back into the past. It's always been there. So probably those rather positive values would be the ones I'd aim for. I'm not sure how much more specific I can be, but certainly values and innovation, absolutely important.
John, we've used up the 2 hours. I just want to say what a delight it's been talking with you. I don't know whether the organizers have any final statements that or notifications they wish to make, but as far as I'm concerned, it's my nap time, so it's time for me to go.
Well, can I just say thanks ever so much? It's been great to have a conversation with you and about things that I know we both care about. And thanks everyone, Joe and George in particular, but thanks everyone for putting up with this conversation for a couple of hours. But it's been great, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Many thanks due to Professor Howard Rush for bringing out various facets of Professor John in this wonderful and insightful conversation. Many thanks to Professor Joe, Dr. George, who become a very important part of the conversation. We are extremely thankful to one and all for the important questions which there is, and we note them down and we try to address them all. And again, I invite you all to the next program in the series about which we would be spreading the words in a couple of weeks. And see you next time. And the next part, which is important, is to just switch on your camera so that we could have a joint picture of all of us together here. So to just memorize. So kindly switch on your cameras and we could have a gallery of us all here. Yeah, many more. Yeah. So with the thank you, thanks a lot. Thank you very much. See you next time. Yeah.
Bye. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank
you. Bye-bye. Thanks, Javi. Thanks, John. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, George. Bye.
Yeah. Feels like one of those parties you want to hang around and just carry on enjoying the chatter.
At least they're not leaving us to clean up.
Good point. Yeah. Nice one. It's good.
Okay.
I enjoyed the surprise, Javi. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. I don't know how you're going to get that into the book.
Great music. Great music.
with a picture of him just speaking that thing. So that would be good.
Well, there's a YouTube channel, so you can listen to them, and I keep trying to. My dream is to create my entire course as songs, and then I don't have to teach it anymore. I'll just play the greatest hits.
And the website is very impressive. I have gone through it, and I've also seen the free version, not the paid one.
Ah, from the course, yeah.
Okay, I'll say goodbye to you now all.
Thank you very much,
Thank you very
everyone.
much.
It's been great.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks.